Think about a serial killer. It's probably a man. Most likely a loner living in a private fantasy world. His murders are a closely guarded secret, and he's desperate to keep them that way. But there is another type. The serial killer who is not alone. My name's Mark Billingham, and I'm a crime writer. I spend my working life creating fictional killers, but in this series, I want to discover what creates those most horrific of real-life murderers, killer couples. In this programme, I'm looking at a pair of school friends who grew up to become two of the most dangerous sexual predators ever to stalk Britain's streets. Their names, John Duffy and David Mulcahy. Kilburn, North London. Here, in 1982, a young woman walking home from a party is dragged into a garden shed and violently raped. This attack marked the beginning of a 4-year reign of terror throughout London and its commuter belt. 18 women, maybe many more, would be seized, often around deserted railway stations, and raped in a series of increasingly brutal attacks. Events took a still darker turn in 1985, when rape turned to murder. 3 women were killed before police finally caught 28-year-old carpenter John Duffy. Yet Duffy was only half the story. Ten years later in prison, he admitted what police had long suspected but could never prove. John Duffy had an accomplice.
We got up to secondary school, which is when he told me that he'd met the person that he committed the offences with. And I said, well, you know, which prison is your co-defendant in? And he said, he's not in prison.
The man the press had dubbed the railway rapist was in fact 2 people, a killer couple. There was John Duffy, caught, convicted and in prison, and his partner in crime, David Mulcahy, an old school friend, free and living an apparently happily married life. I want to know more about this pair and their story. What turned the most ordinary relationships, schoolboy pals, into something so dark and twisted, into partners in rape and murder. I began my search for answers by heading to Chalk Farm, North London, where the pair met, like so many childhood friends, on their first day at secondary school. This is Haverstock School, where John Duffy and David Mulcahy met almost 40 years ago. A meeting that would lead to a tremendous amount of suffering for countless rape victims and ultimately would cost the lives of 3 young women. I thought that Duffy and Mulcahy's time at Haverstock must hold some clues to the killers they became. So I headed to a local cafe where I met former pupil Richard Priestley, who remembered John Duffy well.
This boy with bright ginger hair who used to walk around the playground very much on his own with a Parker coat up with the hood, and just sort of used to sit in the sheds and be totally by himself. What struck me, I think, as being sort of fairly new to the school, was this boy who sort of his behaviour didn't fit with what I would normally think of other kids, you know.
Was that because he was picked on, do you think?
It was quite a tough year he was in. There were some big boys, and I must admit, he was picked on quite mercilessly, if I do recall.
And yet you have no recollection of Mulcahy at all?
No, not at all. As soon as I read the case, Duffy leapt out of the page at me, when Mulcahy was... no.
So, Duffy was the archetypal bullied schoolboy, weak and different looking. The fact that Richard didn't remember Mulcahy too suggests to me that Mulcahy faded into the background, though I was to learn that he did on occasion emerge from the shadows. The Daily Mail's crime editor, Stephen Wright, has written extensively on the pair. He has scoured the past for clues to the killers they became, including an early sign of Mulcahy's cruelty.
Mulcahy was reprimanded by his head teacher. I think he played a game of cricket with a hedgehog, batting the poor animal ferociously, and needless to say it died. I think the interesting thing to note about a case like that, an incident like that, is the number of killers I've dealt with, reported on over the years, who have started out by killing animals and having no sort of feelings at all towards an animal, and they graduate, so to speak, from killing animals to killing human beings.
But of course, Mulcahy didn't graduate alone. He would ultimately rape and kill alongside his best friend, John Duffy, a murderous bond forged by the pair's status as school outcasts.
What was noticeable, they didn't seem to have a wider circle of friends, a large, and they just hang around together.
All the time?
Yes.
So they were kind of like brothers?
They were like brothers, and I think actually Duffy used that phrase at the Old Bailey, we were like brothers. And it was in the playground at Haverstock that they made a pledge to each other, but we'll never ever grass on each other. Obviously that was a pledge which would, a promise to each other, which would be tested many, many years later.
Duffy and Mulcahy's teenage years also offered clues to the way they would later go about their attacks.
Duffy and Mulcahy had a shared interest in the army, got sort of military manuals, that sort of thing, learned how to kidnap and hold people hostage, worrying, sort of developing interest in terrorising people. The mischief they got up to on Hampstead Heath in particular.
Yeah, what was it, jumping out?
Jumping out on courting couples, other individuals up there late at night, taking a very visible pleasure out of frightening people.
Today, the teenage Duffy and Mulcahy would be prime ASBO candidates. Yet, as they left their teens, they gave the appearance of settling down. They married within a year of each other, Duffy in 1977 and Mulcahy in 1978, and both found work. Mulcahy became a plasterer and Duffy a carpenter for a variety of employers, including, significantly, British Rail. But despite the wives and the jobs, Mulcahy and Duffy's desire for illicit thrills did not disappear. Rather, in October 1982, it took a brutal turn. A 21-year-old woman was walking home from a fancy dress party in Kilburn, northwest London, clutching a teddy bear. Using sticking plasters to stifle her screams, Duffy and Mulcahy dragged her into a garden shed where she was stripped, blindfolded, and sexually assaulted. The former practical jokers were now rapists. But how do two friends in their early 20s decide to commit such a hideous crime? It was time to talk to the woman who first heard the full truth about Duffy and Mulcahy, prison psychologist Jenny Cutler.
Both of them found offending very exciting, and rape took that excitement to another level. It involved all the elements that they really found very reinforcing: the chase, the working as a team, the having sort of contingencies for how they were going to operate in certain circumstances, the hunting, the outwitting of the police.
So, Duffy and Mulcahy were driven to offend by their enjoyment of everything their joint attacks entailed. But I was about to learn that for one of the pair, rape was never going to be enough. I'm Mark Billingham, a crime writer, on the trail of Duffy and Mulcahy, two one-time school friends who became mass rapists and then triple murderers. In 1988, John Duffy was convicted, but he kept silent about the equal role of his pal, David Mulcahy. 10 years later, in prison, Duffy revealed to psychologist Jenny Cutler the shocking truth. Mulcahy was his accomplice, and he was still at large.
He said he's never been convicted or tried. Then I knew that, this was something different.
Duffy's revelations kick-started a huge new investigation spanning the pair's 4-year-long campaign of terror. I headed to Scotland Yard to meet the man who led that investigation, Commander Andy Murphy. I wanted to know first how these two best friends turned into serial sex offenders.
One particular weekend, John Duffy's wife was away for the weekend. Margaret was away going on a training course. And Duffy and Mulcahy discussed what it would be like to actually capture somebody, to kidnap somebody and to rape them. There was a clear plan in mind to disorientate them, drive them through parts of London, bring them into an address, take the girl across a rooftop, drop her down through a stairwell just to disorientate, and to keep her there over a weekend. It was an intricately thought-through plan. It didn't happen like that. It was a blitz attack at the end. The first few rapes were indicative of the type of rape you see on a stranger attack, where a victim walked along late at night, is grabbed and brutally assaulted. But as the rapes went on, as they became more confident, they would specifically target areas. They would drive around. During the early stages, they were still breaking into cars, and they'd stolen a copy of Michael Jackson's Thriller tape. And they would play the Thriller track over and over again to G themselves up, looking for a victim. Then when they found a victim, they would control her, they would take her away from that original grab site, they would move her away. One would stand lookout, the other would rape.
John Duffy and David Mulcahy called it hunting. For them, it was little more than an exciting game. But for the women they attacked, their lives could never be the same again.
These women were absolutely terrified, and it was all a matter of they thought they were going to die, and how do I survive?
Police officer Jackie Murphy acted as victim support officer at the 2001 trial of David Mulcahy, helping the rape victims of the pair to recount their horrific ordeals. She had never seen a case quite like it.
I mean, how would you categorise these attacks? Were they particularly violent? I mean, more violent than other attacks you've had to deal with in your career?
Yes, yeah, totally. I think the difference is that these were a pair. And in my service, I've never dealt with rapists that attack in pairs. And the fact that they were so brutal, and they went on for so many years without ever being found.
And do you think that there may still be rape victims out there of Duffy and Mulcahy who you were never able to trace, or who never came forward for one reason or another?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And definitely there'll be women out there, and today, that have not reported rape allegations.
It's chilling to think we'll probably never know how many other victims there are out there. In fact, the more I learnt, the more terrifying Duffy and Mulcahy were becoming. But I wondered just how unusual men like these two are, serial rapists working in tandem. I put that question to criminal psychologist Dr. David Holmes, a man who specialises in understanding the very worst criminals.
It's incredibly rare to have a pair of rapists. I mean, if you kind of look at how it came about, there is a logic. You've got two guys who come together as friends and trust each other and go out together. But this is a very rare thing. I mean, guys go out to pick up, dates in twos, but they don't go to bed together in twos.
It did seem to me kind of how they operated. They were like a pair of 17-year-old lads on the pool. And it was almost like to them, that's how serious it was, or how trivial it was.
Whilst the partnership made the two feel what they were doing was trivial, it also increased the brutality of their crimes and their success in committing assault after assault.
Whenever you get two people jointly committing crimes, it often escalates the amount of violence involved, the degree to which the crime is carried out. Often in a crime situation, a single person has a certain amount of insecurity, but with two of them together, almost invulnerable. You had automatically a lookout and, someone committing the crime. This was a big spree, if you like, over many years. And perhaps part of that sustainability was this kind of, relationship where one would support the other in different ways.
Between 1982 and 1985, Duffy and Mulcahy committed at least 15 attacks throughout Greater London, safe in the knowledge that each was watching the other's back. One victim described the pair as like one mind with two bodies, and press reports spoke of the pair tossing a coin to decide who would rape first. All this suggests the pair were motivated by the same things. Yet Duffy's psychologist told me they had quite different reasons for committing rape, a difference that offered clues as to why they turned to murder.
With John Duffy, I feel, he would acknowledge himself that he was aroused to the idea of rape, but it would appear that David was deviantly sexually aroused to violence. It seemed that it was more important to him to issue threats and be aggressive.
With Duffy aroused by rape, the pair's serial attacks were presumably satisfying him. But Mulcahy was different. As a man turned on by violence, it seems logical to me that he'd want the pair to go further, that he'd want to kill. Alison Day was 19 years old in December 1985 when she caught a train to Hackney Wick Station in East London. It was her tragic luck that Duffy and Mulcahy would be waiting for her. The assault went on as normal, brutal and well organised, until Mulcahy made an apparent mistake. He used John Duffy's name.
It's almost as though Mulcahy set the scene where Alison Day would have to die because he'd called John Duffy by his name, and they had all sorts of strategies worked out where they would never do that. And I think it was, in a way, it gave permission for Mulcahy to take it to that next step, that this woman would have to die because she'd be able to identify them and heard one of their names. Initially, the death of Alison Day prompted a tightening of their bond, really.
After Mulcahy had strangled Alison with a tourniquet, the pair threw her body into the River Lee navigation. With this act, Duffy and Mulcahy graduated from mass rapists to murderers. The pair were clearly living double lives, but how did they appear to the outside world? It was time to meet some people who knew the pair during their campaign of rape and murder. I headed first to meet a man still close to David Mulcahy. Oddly, in the mid-1980s, Mulcahy had become fanatical about roller skating. Junior Mayhew was his skating buddy.
I met Dave when we was roller skating in Battersea Park. Everybody used to go there on a Sunday, and he was learning to skate, and I basically helped him.
And you became friends pretty quickly and stayed?
Well, we used to go there every Sunday and skate around, and then we'd skate during the week. We had a little reputation of always kind of like skating, holding on to buses and stuff like this, right. and we had a great time. But John Duffy was never part of that equation.
But did he talk about John Duffy? Was he somebody that you mentioned?
John Duffy was a name, but that was all, because when we used to talk, we was always talking about skating and stuff that we were doing.
As Junior spoke, it became apparent to me that he believed his friend David Mulcahy is innocent.
I spent a lot of time around Dave's house.
Yeah.
In fact, I actually lived there at one time and never saw John Duffy come into the house.
As far as you knew, he was just some guy that David had been at school with, that he saw now and again, but that was part of his history.
Part of his past, the way I would see it, because he spent most of his present time with me and my friends. David is one of these people that will go out of his way to help just about anybody. He was always a really friendly guy. You only have to pick up the phone and say, hey, look, Dave, I've got this problem. can you help me? And he's there.
Junior clearly still thinks his friend is no rapist or murderer. What's remarkable to me is how Mulcahy has been able to pull the wool over the eyes of so many people. Perhaps this explains how he remained undetected for so long.
He was the kind of person that the next door neighbours would say, oh, yeah, he's a great guy. If I come down with my shopping bags, he'll help me in. And he would. But he would also rape your daughter or your wife.
Unlike David Mulcahy, John Duffy was a more obviously peculiar character. Mother and son Winnie and Martin Thomas knew Duffy well when he worked at their local community centre and lived at the end of their street in Kilburn, North London. The pair remember a more introverted man than his partner in crime.
Well, I first met John when I used to work in the youth club on the estate, and he used to do working with children in the hall, doing activities like snooker, football, darts, or table tennis and things like that.
And what did you make of him first few times you met him?
Well, you know, he used to be a bit bossy with me to make him tea or coffee.
Right.
And used to sit on the counter and used to swing his legs, make me go, and I'd say, well, no, I'm going home now. I mean, it was 12 o'clock at night. And then he used to walk me home.
He's very quiet.
Yeah.
Very withdrawn and very quiet. And he wouldn't come to you and ask you a question if he sees you first. I think, you know, he just look at you, pass you by.
But there was a more worrying indication of the serial rapist he turned into than just social awkwardness, and that was his behaviour towards his wife.
I heard that he used to beat his wife. That's what I was told.
And who told you that?
People in the block. People in the block where he lived. I think she did tell someone that he was doing it to someone in the block, who lived in the block.
But Duffy didn't just beat his wife, he had raped her too. It was a crime that brought him to the attention of the police and would ultimately prove his undoing. Yet for now, Duffy and Mulcahy continued their attacks unabated. And it was around this time that Martin was invited into John Duffy's flat for a cup of tea with him and with his friend, David Mulcahy. We're very interested in how the two of them were together because they committed these awful crimes together. Yeah. And as somebody who had you had the opportunity to see them on a social level having a cup of tea, how were they? What can you remember?
David was more chatty and sociable than John. I just find John just, you know, sit there and listen and not even say anything as a response. It's more like questions and answers. When you go to their flat, it's like you have to ask them a question for them to answer you. Otherwise, you'd be sitting there thinking, oh, you know, we ain't saying nothing.
Duffy and Mulcahy had a lot they wouldn't talk to anyone about. The two men Martin shared tea with were on their way to becoming serial killers. In December 1985, the pair's crimes took a still more brutal turn when they strangled 19-year-old Alison Day close to Hackney Wick Station in East London.
Moving from rape to murder is not unknown. The reason for that is often halfway through or at a point within this criminal career is that they realise they're leaving a lot of evidence and the potential for getting caught is kind of like escalating very rapidly with the number of offences. And what will sometimes happen is they will realise that unless they dispose completely of this person and their testimony, then the chances of getting caught are increasing to the point where it would be unsustainable.
And Alison Day would not be the last victim that Duffy and Mulcahy would so viciously dispose of. Four months later, in April 1986, the railway killers headed far from their North London homes to Horsley in the Surrey commuter belt. It was there the pair killed 15-year-old schoolgirl Margie Tamboza. I headed to meet the police officer who had led the investigation into Margie Tamboza's murder.
This was a young girl who was cycling along a footpath to go and get some sweets to take on a school trip that she was going with her other friends. The following day, her cycle was found up against a tree and her body was found the following morning in a field there. And it was pretty clear that you know, she had died following a sexual assault and then with a tourniquet round her neck. And clearly, We made our minds up, we just have to find this man as quick as we can. We were very worried that whoever this person was at that stage could murder again.
Where the first victim, Alison Day, had been strangled with a tourniquet by Mulcahy, it was John Duffy who had killed Tamboza using the same method. I wondered why Mulcahy had not killed Tamboza too. After all, he was described as the violent one. Psychologist Jenny Cutler suggested it was because Mulcahy feared that Duffy's conscience was getting to him, and he needed Duffy to prove it wasn't.
I think if he had any sense, I think he would have been able to see that perhaps John Duffy, expressed guilty feelings, and I think that should have suggested to him that there might come a time when, John would feel he had to stop what was happening.
But that time showed no sign of arriving. There were 2 mass rapists turned killers at large, and the police needed to start piecing together the evidence from the different attacks.
Charles Farquhar was investigating the murder of Alison Day, who was found in a canal. He got in touch with me and said, look, I think we need to talk because I've got similarities in my murder case with your murder case. In both instances, they'd had a cloth pushed into their mouths, and there was a tourniquet round the neck for where they were actually suffocated.
The police were starting to make links between these 2 murders and the earlier rapes, and drawing up a list of suspects. Because of his conviction for raping his wife, John Duffy was placed on that list, along with 1,800 other known sex offenders. As the police began to whittle their list down, worrying news arrived of another missing person.
Sometime after that, in May, then Anne Locke went missing, with similar circumstances involving the railway station, lone lady leaving the station in the evening to pick up her cycle and cycle home, had disappeared.
Anne Locke was indeed victim number 3. At Brookman's Park Station in Hertfordshire, Duffy and Mulcahy had spied one lone lady's bike in the bike shed, waited for the owner to appear, and then pounced. Her body was found in nearby fields 6 weeks later. Mulcahy and Duffy were now serial killers, but I was surprised to learn that Duffy also continued to commit rape, this time alone. And on his own, Duffy took less care, giving the police the breakthrough they needed, a clear description.
There were 2 cases of rape almost identical to the murder inquiry and the other rapes. The man or the suspect was short, with curly hair and had quite severe acne. We decided that we would have a serious look at Duffy. We searched his parents' home and found the various items we were looking for, like the butterfly knives and the tissues and the matchboxes and so on. Also, we seized a ball of string, which quite a large ball of string, which was subsequently identical to the string that had been Marty Tamboza been tied up with. So all these things were beginning to actually come together.
This evidence, along with the positive ID at identity parades, told police they had the man they were looking for. John Duffy was the railway rapist turned railway killer. But what about the second man earlier rape victims had spoken about? What about David Mulcahy?
Was the notion of a second man brought up during the initial questioning of John Duffy, with Duffy?
Yes, it was. But of course he said nothing about anything. We did a lot of background inquiries on him and found that his only best friend and the person he really only associated with was David Mulcahy. So he was arrested and placed on identification parade, whereas Duffy was picked out by various rape victims and other witnesses who saw him at various locations. Mulcahy was not picked out at all.
Why do you think that was? Looking back on it,
in hindsight, I now know that the victims were terrified, and I know that some of them felt they recognised him, but just didn't pick him out.
Was it the sort of identification parade where they were face-to-face?
Yes,
or
exactly.
They weren't behind glass?
No, those days had not started. The current system had not started in this particular time.
Right.
And it was generally accepted that they walked along a line and looked at sort of 12 people and had to touch or pick them out or whatever it might be.
Oh, that must have been horrendous to suddenly find themselves face-to-face with the man who had attacked them.
Yeah, particularly young girls, you see. It was absolutely terrifying, and even the older ones just absolutely terrified to have to do that.
With no positive ID and DNA evidence to think of the future, Mulcahy would remain free for more than 10 years. The police had nothing on him except his friendship with Duffy, and Duffy wasn't talking. At trial, Duffy was convicted of 7 rapes and the first 2 murders, those of Alison Day and Margie Tamboza. The body of the 3rd victim, Alison Locke, had not been found for several weeks, so crucial forensic evidence had been lost that would have linked Duffy to her murder, though his guilt was widely assumed. Though justice had only partly been done, the deadly partnership of Duffy and Mulcahy was now broken. From the moment of Duffy's arrest, this pair, so close that they raped and murdered alongside each other, would never make contact with each other again. For his part, Mulcahy continued his married life outside, proclaiming his innocence to all. But he was living on borrowed time. Developments in DNA technology, the waning loyalty of his former pal John Duffy, and the persistence of one cop were all about to bring David Mulcahy what he deserved. When Alison Locke was found murdered at Brookman's Park Station in 1987, Les Bolland was the junior detective in charge of the incident room. With Duffy found not guilty, Bolland had an unsolved murder on his patch. And as soon as he gained a more senior position, Les went looking for answers.
So, Les, you were part of the original investigation into Anne Locke's murder. So what made you go back to Duffy?
If you read all the statements from the original Duffy case, especially from the surviving rape victims, there were 2 men involved in those, and it was the larger man of the 2, not Duffy, who was the most violent. So there was still a lot of questions to be answered, and Duffy was obviously one place to start.
So Les went to speak to John Duffy at Whitemoor Prison in Cambridgeshire.
From that initial conversation, I suspected that Duffy would eventually tell the truth about all his crimes, but it may take quite a long period, which is what proved to be the case. And he indicated after a few visits that to recall those offences, which were quite horrendous, he would need psychological counselling and help. Initially, the prison did not want to help us with that, so they made a note on Duffy's record, and when Jenny Cutler began work at the prison, reading his notes, she saw that we were interested in him, and she contacted me, and we took it from there.
But there had also been a little luck in how Duffy's confessions began. Psychologist Jenny Cutler had been called to Duffy's cell to help an apparently disturbed man suffering from recurrent nightmares. And that was when Duffy dropped his bombshell.
Well, I had absolutely no idea. I didn't know anything about John Duffy or his offences. It was presented to me as, you know, sort of he urgently needed to talk to someone who was having dreams. And we got as far as his first day at secondary school when he mentioned that that's where he'd met the person that he committed his offences with. And I said, oh, you know, which prison is your co-defendant in? And he said, he's not in prison. So I'm starting to think, what's he telling me? He said he's never been convicted or tried. So
those
then I knew...
Those moments can't happen too often.
No. So then I knew that, you know, this was something different. And I immediately had to explain to John that if he gave me that sort of information, I would have to pass it on. It would be my duty to report that.
So Jenny phoned Les and set in motion the second police investigation, one that would look to see if Duffy did have an accomplice. It would be an investigation that would also raise an unsettling question. If Mulcahy was in on the rapes and the murders, had he offended again whilst Duffy was locked up? In the 1980s, John Duffy was caught, but kept silent about his accomplice and his crimes. But with no contact between Duffy and his old friend Mulcahy, the bond began to break down. After 9 years locked up, he had started talking. And by the time Detective Les Bolland interviewed him, the cold-blooded killer seemed a very different person.
The press at the time made a great deal of Duffy being, you know, this laser-eyed killer and all this kind of stuff. What kind of man was the man you went to see in Whitemoor in the 90s?
Well, he certainly doesn't like being called laser-eyed. And he was very polite, very charming, very quietly spoken, very well behaved in prison.
Did you believe what he was telling you?
You treat all the evidence that someone like that gives you with a pinch of salt. You have to test it. You have to give the warning of, if you tell one lie and in all the evidence and there's one lie that we can disprove, all your evidence is negated.
So, led by Commander Andy Murphy, the police set about checking Duffy's story. It proved to be remarkably accurate.
Why is he doing this? You know, what's the rationale behind it? Is there something behind it? So, you know, we set out, and the terms of reference for the team were actually to disprove John Duffy.
And you couldn't?
And you couldn't.
With Duffy talking about the pair's many crimes, the police had a huge number of leads. But there was one thing Duffy didn't know. Had Mulcahy carried on offending alone? Astonishingly, it seems that this serial rapist turned serial killer suddenly lost the compulsion to offend once his partner was locked up.
I mean, is there no evidence that he offended himself during that time?
There's no evidence that he offended himself. There's no evidence when they were together offending that he offended on his own.
Whereas Duffy did?
Whereas Duffy did.
Which is quite strange. I mean, you know, if he hasn't committed offences on his own, it sounds like he's the one that actually needed
Duffy to be with him. But he was the leader of the two.
Les thought that Duffy's arrest must also have served as a wake-up call.
Having seen your best friend get several life sentences that are a minimum of 30 years, there's quite a big impetus to give up offending.
Mulcahy's offending days seemed very much in the past, and judging by his response to police questioning, he thought that's where they would stay.
He was arrogant, he was cocky, he got away with it for 10 years. He got away with rape, he got away with murder. Why 10 years on should he be worried?
Persuading the jury at trial to accept the word of a serial killer would be the prosecution's biggest challenge. It would be the first time that a Category A prisoner had ever given evidence at a murder trial. When on the 4th of January 2001, John Duffy took the stand at the Old Bailey as star witness against his former best friend.
It's a fascinating case. It's not very often you get a serial killer, speaking so vividly and, in a compelling way about what he has done. He had nothing to gain. He has been told by the Home Secretary, you are never going to come out.
Mulcahy, though, had everything to lose. And for once, he wasn't able to simply brazen things out. Duffy's testimony had backed him into a corner.
You know, people said at school he was arrogant and cocky. I saw it firsthand at the Old Bailey. He really thought that he was going to get away with it. He was dressed in a suit and initially looked quite convincing. When he came into cross-examination, he lost his rag. But at one stage, the jury were laughing. They were laughing at his answers because they were so stupid. His explanations, it must have been someone who looked just like me, someone who was a friend of Duffy's but also looked like me.
With identical
and
DNA.
Obviously there's been a forensic cock-up over the forensic evidence. No. Everything pointed to him being the accomplice. To use Duffy's words, they had an inseparable bond. They were like brothers.
And it wasn't just Duffy's evidence. DNA linked Mulcahy to one of the series of rapes, whilst 12 of the pair's victims gave vivid and distressing evidence about their assaults.
And when I dealt with one of the rape victims, that lady was so tense right up until the verdict. The relief that she had when he went down and when she knew that man's not going back out on the streets again, she was so happy.
On the 2nd of February 2001, David Mulcahy was found guilty of 7 rapes, 5 conspiracies to rape and 3 murders. He was given 3 life sentences. John Duffy's admission of guilt to all offences gave him a further 12 years. Finally, the killer couple were behind bars. The question remains, though, just why did Duffy talk when he had remained silently loyal to his partner in crime for so many years?
What he said was he wanted to get them off his chest. He realised what he'd done was terrible, and he didn't want on his conscience the fact that his partner in those crimes could do it again.
He'd sort of taken a long time, but he'd almost sort of got back to the point where he was in touch with how a victim might feel, and that got stronger as we went through, and after the trial he was even more distressed about the impact that their offences had had on the victims.
Yet some remain more cynical about Duffy's reasons for finally grassing on his pal.
I don't think, from his track record, that Duffy ever showed that he had a very powerful conscience and desperately needed to unload all of his guilt. I just could not ever buy that, from someone who has shown to be using females as objects, to have carried out brutal, violent, torturous activities. No, I don't think suddenly getting a conscience after 10 years. No, I think it was being bothered by the fact that Mulcahy was out there having a completely free life, made no contact with him whatsoever, and why the hell should he do that when me, his best buddy, the person who would have stood by him, is here in prison rotting from day to day with no chance of any change or improvement in his life? No, I think that was probably a stronger motive.
Whatever his motive, John Duffy has admitted his crimes and turned on his one-time friend. Mulcahy claims he must have been enticed to do this, yet I'd heard Duffy's position in prison has been far from improved.
These rumours, I think, come about because nobody could quite believe that what he'd actually got out of it was an extra life sentence. And, he remains a Category A prisoner. He has no extra privileges. He can't forgive himself. There was no likelihood that anybody else would be able to forgive him. He's a Catholic. He's never asked for absolution, for instance. And I think he just felt somehow that there would be some lightening of that burden of guilt, but I think that just didn't really happen for him.
This is a dossier that David Mulcahy has put together that was passed on to me by his friend Junior. In it, he raises various points that apparently prove his innocence. He claims the DNA must have been planted and that Duffy was offered money. There's no substance to any of it. Yet Mulcahy's supporters still refuse to believe that their friend could have committed these crimes. And Mulcahy himself is clearly still in denial. This is a letter from him in which he says, "I firmly believe that truth is like a fistful of sand. You may hold it tightly, but it will always find a way out." And there isn't even the tiniest part of you that thinks maybe David had some dark secrets that you didn't know about?
Not that. Definitely not that. Not even a tiny little bit.
No doubt.
He could have hung around. He could have hung around with people done a naughty thing here, a naughty thing there, like what we did when we held onto cars and got into trouble that way and had to go to court for holding onto vehicles at high speed and stuff like this. But
he's not a rapist, he's not a killer.
He's not a rapist and he's not a killer. No way.
Junior is clearly devoted to his friend, yet everyone else involved in this case finds Mulcahy's claims to innocence absurd. What do you make of the fact that Mulcahy is still maintaining his innocence? He has friends who still fight for his innocence or his appeal and so on. How do you react to that?
I think a DNA profile says it all, doesn't it?
This pair were responsible for some of the most hideous crimes of modern times. What I found perhaps most sickening about their story is what a perversion it is of normal childhood best friends. Long friendships forged at school are usually a force for good. Yet this pair supported each other not through life's ups and downs, but in carrying out a campaign of rape and murder. Only when that bond of friendship was broken was justice served, and the pair both put where they belong.